started.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Helm Dev Call. Today is Thursday, July 19th. And the format of this call, usually we have announcements, followed by a stand-up, followed by any open discussions. But today, I think we wanted to spend a little bit of time to go over some of the new governance changes. So we'll get right into that. But before we get into that, any other announcements from anyone in the room?
Yeah, I've been the issue triage person, and I've been doing it every day, but there's a few bugs that I need some help looking into. So if anyone has some time today and can help me with doing more research on bugs, then I could just point you to an issue. So just reach out if you have time. If you don't, that's okay too.
Also, we had a little bit of an emergency this week and ended up accelerating the move from Kubernetes Helm to Helm far in advance of our original plans. It looks like we're still having a couple issues getting Circle to run, but otherwise, unless anyone has seen anything contrary, it appears that everything is working.
We're having issues with Circle? I thought it was.
There are a few builds that aren't going through right now.
It's not because of Circle, it's because of the CLA bot. Last I checked.
Okay. Well, I'll keep working on troubleshooting that today, and anybody else who wants to help is welcome.
Okay, cool. If there's no more announcements, Butcher, do you want to lead us into the section talking a little bit about the governance that we were discussing on the email list?
Yeah, so as part of the move to CNCF, as you all know, we are responsible for coming up with our own governance model. So we have, because we are no longer governed by the Kubernetes board. So Matt Farina, who really I'll turn it over to in just a second, wrote up a proposal for a new governance structure. I jumped in with him and we iterated on that several times. And then he opened up a pull request, I believe, in the community, in the GitHub/Helm/community repo, outlining a governance structure that would basically serve us from here going forward. So it's designed to be as equitable as possible while still being as simple as possible, so we don't kill ourselves with bureaucratic overhead. So I'll turn it over and let Matt kind of describe the basics of that proposal, but everybody should take a look at that. We had 90 days from the inception of Helm as a CNCF project to adopt a new governance model. I think we're about 32, 33 days, somewhere like that, into the process. So we're not under a time crunch yet, but it would be nice to get this kind of done so that we don't all have to vote on every single issue that comes up, which is the state we're all in right now.
So, okay. It actually was not a pull request yet. It's still up on HackMD.
Oh, that's right. I forgot. Yeah, okay.
I guess I can share it publicly.
Did you drop the link in there? Yeah.
There's the link in here. This is built based on other CNCF projects, along with looking at some of the things that we've done inside of Kubernetes as templates for it. I was hoping that it would inspire conversation, and a bunch of things did inspire conversation, which is good. It happened. Some of this, for those of you who don't know, happened on internal lists or in one-offs, but this is kind of what we're looking at. It talks, you'll see, primarily it gives roles and responsibilities here for who has what roles. So at the top, it defines the Helm project and how it's made up of multiple code bases that do different things. Right? Like there's charts, Monocular, Chart Museum, Helm the package manager itself. You'll see it even talks about the public chart search and discovery, which is an alternative proposal currently up in the community repo. And then it gets into maintainer structure. And it looks at two kinds of classes of maintainers. There's the Helm project maintainers, which oversee all of the things, Helm, charts, monocular, all of this, but they're kind of that high level governance, right? And then there's the code base maintainers who handle the day in and day out work on the code bases. And it's kind of a separation of responsibilities and also how things get announced and how people are added or removed from those different categories. And it outlines things like any changes in maintainership have to be announced on the mailing list. So that way everybody knows. We're good with transparency. And like the project maintainers, right? They deal with things like the mission, vision, values, and scope of the project. If this charter here ever needs to be refined, they're responsible for it. Project level, high level decisions. You'll see some of it, managing financial decision related to the project, right? Do we someday have something we need to hire a contractor for or something like that? Okay, we're going to do those kinds of things. A code of conduct issues. They'll also be the owners for repositories and things like that. They're the final folks who can make and change things on that stuff. So it's these kind of high-level project-level things, not the day in and day out code things. So if we're going to like add another sub-project, they would be the final responsibility to say, okay, we can add this, we've agreed to add it, but they won't oversee maybe the technical decisions of it. They'll just say when we add it, its vision has to be in line with everything else we already have and choose those kinds of things. Right? And then it kind of gives a process for how people are added or removed from that, right? We need to have between 3 and 9 and maintaining an odd number. And that odd number is so that, so when voting comes, you don't have to deal with ties and tiebreakers, right? There's always a way out of that. And it puts criteria like a code base maintainer is eligible to be a project maintainer. You can't just be some one-off person like an executive at a company who doesn't touch on anything else, right? We also say things like no company or organization can employ a simple majority. They can't have a majority of people because that gives them massive decision-making control of a project from a single company. There's some things like this in here. You've got to be active. If you become unresponsive, then you can lose your project maintainership. So if you up and go away, then there's a thing that says, okay, you're not going to be a project maintainer anymore. You have to be involved. And there's some things like that. It talks about how new ones can be added. So maybe, and how you resign. So if somebody decides they don't want to do it anymore, then it gives the process for that. And then also the process for adding somebody new, which is a supermajority vote. And there's a link off to what that means. And of course, when somebody leaves, they step down, it actually defines that they become an emeritus. But it defines things like that as far as those overall decision makers. Are there any questions so far? Awesome. Then the code base maintainer.
You had hands.
Oh, I did. Sorry.
I had a question.
Oh, please. Yeah.
How are the project maintainers elected? What's like the bootstrapping process, and then what's the process going forward? Do you have that yet?
So we don't have the bootstrapping process. It's one of the to-dos at the bottom.
Okay.
One of the things Matt and I talked about was how do we do this fairly and equitably amongst all the different sub-projects? Like how do we divide it up? How do we bootstrap it? I think that is a really good open question. That's worth discussing. And I thought that was something we should probably take to this larger group and any larger group for that. As far as how does somebody get, that's in there. It is when there's an opening for a new project maintainer, existing maintainers can nominate suitable replacements. When a nominated individual agrees to be a candidate for maintainership, the maintainers may vote, right? And the nomination, of course, from previous stuff, it has to be somebody who's a code-based maintainer, and we need between 3 and 9. So if you got 9 people, you can't nominate somebody. We got to maintain an odd number. If it comes down to 8, we need to nominate somebody, things like that. And somebody obviously has to accept. So this is kind of the loose process around it. And then it's a supermajority vote of existing maintainers for somebody to get elected.
Did I just hear you say that a project maintainer has to come from a code-based maintainer? Or did I just get that wrong?
You have to be a code-based maintainer to be a project maintainer.
Why is that the case? Mainly because people who excel at project maintainership type things may not excel or even want to be active as a code-based maintainer.
I think the original thinking of this, and granted, this was all, by the way, this was all put together not to have a super opinionated stance, but to get the ball rolling because I didn't know if anybody else wanted to actually write something up.
This is a great document, by the way, and
But
I
yeah,
actually
yeah,
read
yeah.
it and I gave feedback on it. I just thought about that today, like now.
No, and I think it's good. It's so they have actual skin in the game, right? If you got a case where you got a bunch of managers from different companies who didn't have skin in the game with the code base, it gives the idea that you've actually got skin in the game and you really care about where the project is going and whatnot in order to be involved. And the code base maintainers are the people who are kind of running the day-to-day operations of the project anyway. They've got to make project level decisions, code base level decisions. Do I merge this feature? How do I handle with folks? I understand it's slightly tangential from dealing with code of conduct and things like that and those top level things. But at the same time, it forces folks who have skin in the game to be involved in this. So you don't end up with a case with a bunch of engineers, because I'm not just thinking the way it is today. How will it be in 6 months or a year or 2 years, right? And so you don't end up with like managers and executives at a company who don't have skin in the game on the project being at this top level, and then their engineers being code-based maintainers. It kind of doesn't let those kinds of situations happen. It forces anybody who's going to be involved to actually have skin in the game. That was the idea.
It's worth pointing out that there's nowhere that we have restricted code-based maintainers to be software engineers either. And in fact, Helm has a history of having people who did not contribute software to the project, but who played other roles in the project. But we're not going to define how code-based maintainers have to chop up their responsibilities. The idea really was just to make it so that we didn't have outsiders insisting on positions as project managers who had little or no experience actually working on the projects. And I think it's more experience that matters here. We want the ideas, the personality that occurs in the community to bubble all the way up to the top leadership. So when people walk through the process of engaging community members respectfully and in a welcoming kind of way, and then become project maintainers, the idea is they would carry that particular psychology along with them to the project maintainership. And we don't end up with a project maintainership that ends up being very top-down authoritarian when that goes against the way we've run the individual projects.
You'll also notice in the code-based maintainers, there's no restriction on, the only thing is, adding one is a supermajority vote. Otherwise, they have a lot of freedom in how they add folks, right? If somebody's going to be added to Chart Museum, it's up to the other Chart Museum code maintainers to decide who should do it and who shouldn't. We're not saying there's a lot of other places where you've got that level of control. It just kind of is a filtering function for this, right?
Yeah, and I think that makes a lot of sense, the skin in the game portion, and also like not defining code-based maintainers as software engineers. That clears up a lot for me. I didn't catch that part the first time I read it, so as long as that's the case, it makes sense.
Yeah, we should probably make that explicit that it's not a project, that it's not a top level requirement that a code-based maintainer is a software developer.
Yeah, I think that's a really good idea to add that in.
Yeah, and reading through that paragraph, it makes more sense now, but it's just the first time it wasn't so explicit, so I love that explicit sentence.
Okay, no, I like that. We'll add it in. Then it gets into the kind of the code-based maintainer, and where we saw before the project maintainers in this had kind of that top-level project. Here it talks more about what the code-based maintainers are responsible for. Things like development and release activities, right? For anything, whether it's a code base or even a service like the website, which kind of is operated, right? They're responsible for all of those activities. That's technical decisions, and basically anything. The one time that this could bubble up to the project maintainers is if you had the code-based maintainers for two different things, right, disagreeing. Like theoretically, let's say we're talking about specs for repositories, and Helm and Chart Museum, the technical people just cannot decide on what they're going to do. Then it could be bubbled up to the project maintainers to figure out how do you resolve it? It doesn't mean they have to do the resolution. It just means that they would be the authority to figure out how to handle that. And it's just, I actually don't expect this ever to like be the case given the personalities and all the cross-pollination we have. It's just to kind of put that structure in.
Did you see Joe's question in there?
Yes, Joe, that's a great question. What happens if somebody steps down permanently till they're replaced? One of the other maintainers temporarily steps down as a voting member. I would say probably not. We just immediately have to kick in the process of getting a replacement in. And if we don't, then somebody probably does need to decide to step down along with them to keep that odd number. I think it's okay to have short periods where we don't have that, as long as the highest priority is actually getting a replacement. But we probably do need to codify that. And then on the code-based maintainers, right, it's, anybody steps down, it has to be emailed. Any change has to be emailed on the mailing list. A maintainer must be active. If they are unresponsive for 3 months, greater than 3 months, they'll be automatically removed unless the project maintainers decide to let them stick around, and you need to vote on that. So if somebody, works for a company and they get paternity or maternity leave and they're going to dry up for a half a year, right? We might just say, you know what, they're going to stay on. We just know they're going to go away for a while. But if somebody just becomes unresponsive, and we do have a handful of folks who are code-based maintainers who are like this, who've just become pretty much unresponsive and you can't get a darn thing out of them, they will no longer be able to be listed. It'll just be an automatic that they go away. We do have some folks that this will just now kick in for. For most folks who are involved in the project, it won't. And then there's, of course, it deals with the case of when a code base has no maintainers anymore. It becomes under the project maintainers to figure out what to do with it, to either find new code base maintainers or to archive the project. But it's their responsibility to figure out what happens if there are no more code base maintainers. Yeah, how does that top level leadership get? Matt Butcher put an interesting thing here, is how do you keep it fair and equitable across all of them? So like one or two of the sub projects don't dominate the project maintainership in it. And that's one thing that I didn't have a good place to start on, but I was hoping y'all did.
Is there an idea of a number of seats per project based on usage, or some metric that we can come up with to say how they should be split or something like that? Because obviously the more popular, you would hope the more popular projects have more maintainers, or at least more people interested to be able to be in those positions, and probably should steer things with more weight, presumably. Now obviously that could be a problem, but in theory that would work best. The projects with most people behind them had the most weight.
Yeah, I think someone mentioned using stars as a metric for that.
Yeah, but then you get into cases, and I'll just take an example. Say you've got something like Chart Museum, and Josh is like the only maintainer on Chart Museum, I want to say right now. And what if he sure as heck doesn't want to do a project maintainership because he wants to focus on code? This is just a radical what if. What if he doesn't want to? If you tried to make it fair and equitable, you might force him to do something he doesn't want to do, right? But maybe he does. But how do you have what do we do with that level of thing? I think it's a good question.
I'll just describe what happens in the CNCF community, but I don't think that it applies here, just for an example though. So like the CNCF has a governing board, and the governing board has 2 developer seats, and one developer seat comes from the Kubernetes steering committee, and the other developer seat represents like every other CNCF project in the CNCF. So it's like they kind of take into account that Kubernetes is kind of like an important project, and have one person specifically elected from Kubernetes steering. I don't know if that's right or wrong. So me and Brian and Phillips are the people, developer seat representatives on CNCF, but we don't actually function like that. We just end up representing all of the projects like together, and kind of split those responsibilities. But just to give a reference out there.
Oh, good. Thank you. So I'll try and keep going through this document since we've only got 7 minutes left here. The next section actually gets into the decision making when we need to make decisions. And the default decision making process is explicitly stated as lazy consensus. So that way we can much more, instead of having to vote on everything, we can go with a lazy consensus model because a lot of things don't need it. But it does talk about when consensus cannot be found, that we use a majority vote decision on those things. And so if lazy consensus doesn't work, people speak up and have an issue. That works. And then for many of the, because many things can be done this way. It also gets into some of the things where you can't use lazy consensus on, which is things like, and what you have to use in its place. So like enforcing a code of conduct violation needs a supermajority, right? And there's a question there, should it be a simple majority or supermajority? We should probably discuss that. Electing new maintainers, you can't do that lazy consensus, supermajority. Removing a maintainer, changing the governance rule structure, which is this document, all those are supermajority. Anything that deals with licensing and intellectual property changes, things like logos, word marks, that requires a simple majority. Archiving or removing sub-projects, and then utilizing money for anything that's not cheap and easy. And the cheap and easy term actually comes from the CNCF. So project maintainers will be able to go to the CNCF and ask them for certain things. And if it's cheap and easy, they just do it. And if it's not, they come back and say, this is not cheap and easy. We need to talk about it. And so that's where the cheap and easy term
is that process well outlined on the CNCF side?
Yeah, there's a dashboard you can go to, or it's a portal.
Okay.
And you can request things there. And then if it's like a larger item, you kind of like write out what you want. And before every governing meeting, and so the first thing you do is go to the portal. But if that doesn't work out, then you end up bubbling it up to the developer representatives on the CNCF, and then they ask CNCF for some money.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Cool. I'd like a link in there if possible to that portal. Obviously, I can use the link myself, but just have it.
I just dropped a link in to their portal, or to their stuff, I should say. It's the CNCF service desk is how they do it. And it's documented here for now. And so that's the gist of the decision making. Then it gets into the code of conduct. The Helm project maintainers will handle that, and it says how to report to the project maintainers. And then it also actually goes into if the project maintainer needs to be recused of this, what happens. And then we'll use the appropriate CNCF contact, and the CNCF may choose to intervene or handle this. We wanted to say if it's the project maintainers, we actually want to hand this off to the CNCF when possible.
I'm actually learning a lot about code of conduct and all of that right now, since we're dealing with that in Kubernetes. But there's not necessarily a CNCF code of conduct committee or anything, like a committee at the CNCF level, excuse me. So is there an email address that they're supposed to send something to?
In the code of conduct, there is.
Okay, perfect.
And how it goes. And my understanding is if you have a case like this, it's actually where the CNCF needs to step in. It's actually the TOC's responsibility to handle that.
Oh, that's really good to know. Didn't know that. Thanks.
At least that's what I think it was Dan told me that.
Okay.
He can clarify, but the TOC can step in those situations. Okay, then the next situation is DCO and licenses. And we actually note that, the Apache 2 for any code, for documentation, it can be under the Creative Commons Attribution 4 International Public License. These are both the ones that Kubernetes uses today. And then for new contributions, the DCO. So one of the things we're going to be switching to here, which is not announced to the whole world yet, and it'll be coming probably next week is when we'll talk about it, is we're going to switch from the CLA to a DCO. And so that's documented here. All of the details, all of the implications, all of that will come out. If you've got questions, we'll deal with that later. But we're under the CLA for the moment, but we're switching to a DCO, and that's documented here. And then there's the whole section on outstanding issues, which is, how do we guarantee fair representation in sub-projects. We've talked about that. Is that the only one we've got left? Yeah, that's the current open issue, is how do we deal with those things? And then there's the escalating to the CNCF for those things, or for COC stuff, which I think you put in, Michelle. But those are the issues. So feedback, comments. I know there's a couple of things we can probably clean up in the language, including the two we grabbed today, which would be the to-dos are like the ghost, right? Like the period of somebody steps down, you've got an even number to get back to an odd number for project maintainers, and that code-based maintainers don't need to be software engineers. And that'll probably become especially true since we want to talk about breaking docs out into its own repo, and the people who do the docs may have nothing to do with the code. There's another good example of it. So we can explicitly add those things. Did I miss any other pieces of feedback or questions or thoughts?
I put something in the chat in response to the sub-project having like basically fair representation from the sub-projects. I think like in the case of Chart Museum specifically, I don't necessarily need equal weight making decisions on the Helm project, only as it relates to repository management. So if there's a way to kind of, I don't know, for each decision that needs to be made to see, does it fall into the scope of this sub-project or this sub-project, give those code-based maintainers some more say, I guess. But I'm not.
What kind of thing? Do you have an example? Because right now, any operational, release, technical, any of that falls with the code-based maintainers for something.
No,
He means
I
like
understood
code
this to mean the Helm CLI changes. Like if you're adding like authentication, OAuth authentication to the CLI for repos, that's important to me because I may have something that I'm kind of thinking of or working on. So if that's being brought up on the Helm level, that's when I think it matters for me and my perhaps future co-developers to.
So what would be quantified in here? Because right now, what this thing does say is that all those kinds of decisions are just kind of left up to the technical or to the code-based maintainers, and only if there's some kind of disagreement between those, like you disagree with the people working on Helm core about authentication, and now we got to figure out how to resolve it. So then the project maintainers would come in to figure out a resolution on this because we can't come to agreement there. So the question is, what else should be codified in the governance structure on this? Right, like what, because this is governance structure, and like how different sub-projects want to communicate and do stuff today may not need to be in here.
What about dealing with interfaces? Like I think one of the things that we have similar in the chart side is just like if the formats of things are changing, we should be involved in those decisions, right? Maybe even just from like a coordination standpoint. But there should be like some provision for things that are intersectional to include the people that they're intersecting, or something like that. I don't know that the Helm. I don't think that the Helm project would just go off and make random decisions to change protocols of things and never include us. But I think that's kind of what Josh is getting at.
Right,
Okay.
and I think also the sub-projects need to be. Another thing that's important to me is that the scope of the projects are well defined, because we had a conversation about like monocular versus a chart museum UI, and understanding, for the sake of the community, what are the projects responsible for. Don't try to like do all the things, just do one thing very well. I have to drop, unfortunately. I want to talk about this forever, but
So I like where you're going. I guess the two things I would say to this is we've been pushed to kind of keep stuff light and not get overcomplicated. So that is definitely an intent here. What I would say is that for the code base maintainers, we could do something like any interfaces within the Helm project should take into account all of the code bases that it relates to. Something along those lines could be put in there, because then I like what you said, Vic, with it's the interfaces, not so much the implementations. That'll probably force us to actually document our interfaces, which is another to do. Like, what's the chart spec? What's the repo spec? How do these things work? And what are the interfaces? To actually make sure all of that stuff works well. So that would be my guess for a one-liner to put in.
Yeah, I think so. Just a mention of that. I don't know how to enforce that, or how we even would decide what is necessary in the discussion of that interface. But I think for us now, it's relatively easy to understand that.
Yeah, and remember, we can iterate on this, right? We can start too loose, and then if we realize we're having trouble, we can iterate on it to make it tighter and to add more scope to it. The whole idea of being lightweight is a big thing, because Kubernetes has an incredibly complex governance structure, which takes a lot of work to manage and work on. No other CNCF project has nearly as many people or as much complexity, and we don't. And so it's been asked of us to really consider thinking, how do we keep it as light as possible and only adding complexity where we need it. And so like when it comes to repo maintainership versus organization maintainership, how much complexity needs to be in the governance, and how much can we say, the code base maintainers, they can just get admin access to their repos, and the project maintainers can get admin access to the org, and we'll just fly with that, right? Is that good enough? And then as we need things, we'll just talk to each other, because we're not that big and complicated.
Yeah.
I'm just asking the question again. I'm not trying to throw too much out there. All right, we are 5 minutes over, as Butcher points out. I'm actually not the person who's running the meeting, so somebody else is supposed to time check me.
Oh yeah,
sorry, that was me. We were having a really interesting and important conversation, but I want to be respectful of folks' time. So I think it's probably worth having more of these conversations next week and during next week's meeting, and follow up with some of the points that have come up. But before we all leave, I just want to make sure that we have assignments for next week. So any folks volunteering to be issue Sherpa for next week?
I can do that.
Okay.
Actually, around for the entire week.
Notes? Thanks, Butcher. Anyone for notes? I can do notes next week. And anyone for meeting moderator?
I can do that next week.
Okay, that was Fisher, right?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Thanks, guys. Sorry we went over a few minutes, but great, awesome discussion. So so that's the Helm meeting. I will see you all next week.
Yeah, thanks a lot for all that feedback on that. That was very helpful.
Thank you.
Yeah, and thanks, Matt, Farina, and Butcher for driving some of the governance things. It's nice to see these it shaping up. So thanks, guys.
Thanks, folks. Bye.